Welcome to the Influencing Policymakers for Happiness module of the Happiness Initiative Leadership Training. This training is provided by Board Director of the Happiness Alliance, Jean Crowder.
Hi, my name is Jean Crowder, and I'm with the Happiness Alliance, and I'm here to talk to you about happiness in public policy. Specifically, I want to talk about the barriers to making change for policymakers and legislators. First, we're going to talk about what gets in the way of making change, and then we're going to talk about some really great ways to influence policymakers and legislators. The barriers to change and ways to move forward on it. I think the first question that we have is, why bother? Why would we want to try to influence policy? And what we understand about this is that we know that legislation, that policy decisions shape the way our communities, our states, our provinces, our nation functions. And this can be as minor as which streets get the potholes fixed, to as major as what kind of national spending priorities are set in place. Do our national spending priorities go on healthcare, or do they go on military, or do they go on peace initiatives? So it's really important that we look at what it is that our policymakers and legislators are using for decision making. One of the other rules is you get what you measure. And so we know that in most places in the world, national governments use something called GDP, gross domestic product, to measure how well a country, a nation, a state is doing. And what we also know about gross domestic product, GDP, is that it measures all kinds of activities that don't actually benefit the citizenry. So for example, you could have an oil spill, and the cleanup of the oil spill is included in your GDP. But we all know that the impact on the environment is pretty severe. And so despite the fact that you've got a negative activity, you've got something that is actually going to increase your GDP. What many of us argue in the happiness movement is that you need a much more holistic measure of how well a government, a state, a province, a city is doing. With happiness indicators, what they actually do is measure a much more holistic approach, and that could be everything from the economy to community safety. What we also know is that what we measure drives resource allocation. So for example, if GDP is the primary measure of how we say a country is doing, we tend to focus more on initiatives that will increase GDP. Whereas when you have a much more holistic well-being measure, it's going to include things like healthcare, like community safety, well-being measures that community members themselves, citizens of a state or nation, will identify as being really important to them. The role of government is critical when we are looking at policy. It doesn't matter what level of government. If you're talking about a city government, they're going to determine what the priorities are in your city, what the zoning is like. If you're talking about a province or a state government, they're going to be talking about what happens within their boundaries. And of course, a national government is going to be looking at measures that influence the whole country. I love this quote, and because we've been using things like GDP for so long, and we find that in many cases, what happens is that GDP will increase, but citizens' sense of well-being doesn't increase concurrently with the rise in GDP, that we just keep doing more of the same. And yet the results don't necessarily increase citizen well-being. Why? Why do we do that? Making change at the policy and legislative level and what gets in the way is really the focus of this talk. There's a number of things that stop change from happening. One of them is inertia. It's more comfortable to keep rolling along without making significant change. And in many cases, unless there's significant pressure to change from within, from citizens, from political parties, from other levels of government, it's easier to stay the course and perhaps tinker at the margins, because many times change is frightening. And so people would rather stay the course rather than take the chance of making change. Now, maintaining the status quo is a little bit similar, but a little bit different. Many political parties run on a platform to get elected. They get elected based on what they promise to their citizens, and whether they fulfill those promises or not is another matter. People want to maintain their power base, and many political parties and politicians see their job as at least to maintain what got them into power, if not to grow their own political party. So there's a drive within political systems to just stay the course. The process for change within political parties in itself is difficult. Many political parties have bylaws that govern how change is made within a political party. Many political parties have conventions, and there's all these rules about how things get on the convention floor. Anybody who's tried to make change in a political party understands there's a significant amount of work that has to lead up to any policy getting voted on within a political party. And that takes a lot of effort. It takes things like identifying who your supporters are. It takes planning to get the motion on the floor. It takes planning to have people speak to the motion. It's often difficult and cumbersome within political parties to make the kind of change that a political party can then take on their national or provincial or state stage. Polarization, where people are firmly entrenched in their particular point of view, it becomes very, very difficult to take on other parties' good ideas, even though it may help change. And it's very difficult to have the kinds of in-depth conversations that would help move away from the polarization. The last 2 points are with regards to how governments themselves often operate, government departments. Typically, government departments operate in silos. I have an example. When I was in federal politics, I was responsible for looking at water. And when at the national level, there was 12 different government departments that had a role in how water was governed in our country. And those departments did not talk to each other. And that's quite common in government departments, that you have these kinds of silos that just don't communicate, don't share information, don't make plans together. With regards to leadership, at the heart of change is finding leaders who are willing to support initiatives. One of the challenges at the political level is that politicians change. And there are any number of examples out there where you've got a politician who says, yes, this is a great initiative, I'd like to see us move forward on it, and then they don't get elected again. And all the work that you've done falls by the wayside. So in many cases, when you're seeking leadership to support change, it's really important to find leaders within the bureaucracy, non-elected leaders who are also willing to champion the change. Because just relying on political leaders can really leave your initiative at risk. And in fact, if the new politician or new government that comes in doesn't want to take on another political party's initiative, even if it's a great idea and they think it's a great idea, they won't take it on because it was another political party's idea. We're going to talk about ways to tackle these barriers. There are a number of ways. One of the ways is grassroots campaigns. And the grassroots campaigns are often citizen-led initiative at the local. They can be at the national level as well, but there are people who actually are doing the hard work about gathering the information, gathering supporters, planning a campaign, rolling it out, following it up. And so they're doing all of that great work to bring attention to something that they want to see changed at the policy or the legislative level. And in that state, you find working partners. This includes mobilizing and organizing. I've touched on a little bit of this, advocacy and lobbying, and using the media. I love these two quotes. This is from John Adams in the 1770s. And John Adams said, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." Now, you would think facts in and of themselves standing alone, and the happiness movement has well documented, well demonstrated statistics on saying why a more holistic measure is far better than just using GDP. So you'd think standalone, this information would just have people changing their minds. But then you have the other side of the coin where people say, don't confuse me with the facts, I've got a closed mind. And there's some new research talking about the fact that just presenting facts doesn't change people's minds. You've got to find something that speaks to them personally that helps them change their mind. I'm going to turn to advocacy and lobbying. In many of our countries, lobbying has got a bad name. However, What lobbying is really about is presenting information and doing a persuasive case to present policy and legislators with ideas about how they might do things differently. I'm going to give you some tips to influence policy and legislators. And this isn't just about politicians. This is also about finding key policymakers within organizations, because they're, as we pointed out earlier, they're critical to shaping how policy might be changed and maintained. Having a team is absolutely critical. And what you want is people on the ground who can take up various aspects of what it would look like. It would bring a variety of skills and abilities. And sometimes if it's a small campaign, you need 3 people. But if it's a national campaign, you're going to need a broad cross-section of people. The next thing you need to do is you need to make a plan. The plan is going to include, have you got the right person organization? Are you targeting the people you really need to speak to? I'm going to use water as an example. Let's say that you're concerned that fish are dying in your local creek. In Canada, fish is a national issue. Yes, it's important to talk to your local politicians and your provincial politicians because there may be some roles for them, but you need to go federal, you need to go national on that particular issue of fish dying in the creek. So make sure you've got the right level of government, the right level of policymaker. You've identified who it is, but before you've done that, you've scoped out your problem, clearly identified what the issue is. And so in terms of happiness and well-being, you know that what you want to do is you want a more credible measure of how well our country, state, government is doing. And then you get very specific about that. So get very clear about what your problem is. Problem is GDP doesn't measure the well-being in the community. I'm simplifying this. And then you want to get very clear about what it is that you want the policymaker or the legislator to do. And when you're doing that, you're making your plan, you're gathering the information, you're getting background, you're identifying key people that are involved, you're identifying who those main speakers are, main players are that you need to speak to. And so this is the know your message. And then when you're going to meet with the policymaker, you want a very specific, direct ask. I always used to tell people when they used to come in to see me as a politician, don't ask me for world peace, right? I can't do that. Ask me specifically, make it doable, make it measurable, make it something tangible, make it something that you know that I can do. Be very specific about what you want that person to do. When you actually go in to meet them, you want to actually give them a time frame. As you're building your plan, you want to know who your supporters are and who is against you. Right? It's really important to know who's against you because you're going to have to develop arguments to counter what it is that they're saying. You also need to know who your supporters are, because this is, especially at a national campaign, you're going to want a coalition, a broad cross-section of people who can write letters of support, who are willing to lobby their own politicians in their own region. In your campaign, you're going to use all the tools that you've got available. So you're going to meet with the policymaker, the legislator. You're going to have your specific ask. You're going to ask them to commit to something. So, will you speak to the minister in charge? Because you're talking to a politician who may not be the minister in charge. Will you speak to the minister in charge about the fact that fish are dying in my local creek? And will you do it by 2 months? And you get a commitment from them that they're going to do that. And here's the tough part about lobbying. You have to follow up. So when I say you have to follow up, what you need to do is, if they said they would do X in 2 months, you haven't heard back from them, you need to get back to them. You said you would write this letter, or you would see the minister, or you would raise this at committee, and I haven't heard from you. So what's happened? This is the hard part of lobbying. Many people think that all they have to do is just meet with their policymaker or legislature, present their case succinctly, 1 or 2 pages, not pages and pages. You can provide the background information, 1 or 2 pages, and then that's it. But lobbying means that you have to have sustained pressure. You have to follow up. You have to meet with other key people. Perhaps you have to meet with your staff. And that's in your plan. So what are you going to do in 3 weeks? What are you going to do in 6 weeks? What are you going to do 3 months down the road? Because a lot of times, particularly if you're talking about something as large as happiness and well-being, it's going to be a more sustained campaign. One of the key things is around media. Use earned media. Earned media means you don't pay for it. It's a free use. So you can write op-eds for your local newspapers or your national newspapers. You can write letters to the editor. You can devise news releases on key things that are happening and send them to the newspapers. Many small local newspapers are under-resourced, and so they're often happy to print op-eds and news releases because they don't have the resources to go out and do the research. Build a relationship with your local editorial board so they're more open and willing to take on articles that you're sending. Whenever you do a news release, it's really important to follow up with the newspaper, particularly if they haven't printed it. But if they have printed it, and say you were announcing a particular event, you want to follow up and let them know how the event was, send them some photos of the event. So really use that local media and national media to your advantage. Letters to the editor are really important. And what you can do is you can draft key points, but have people put it in their own language. Send those in and have a variety of people do it, because if it's the same writer over and over and over again, oftentimes newspapers will stop reporting them. Always be factual. Always be factual. Make sure you know your information. Make sure that you can back it up. If you burn a news source by giving them incorrect information, you'll have a harder time getting back to them. So always be factual. Social media is a very powerful tool, whether it's using Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or any of the other platforms out there. A web page, it's a very powerful way to run a campaign. And a number of years ago, it's just one example of a campaign, but there was a piece of legislation before Parliament that was going to put in restrictions on internet access. People were outraged, and so somebody started a Twitter campaign called #TellVicEverything. Vic was the minister who was responsible for this. Every day, people would tweet this hashtag and say, well, I got up and I had breakfast this morning, or I went for a walk, or my dog, was tired. There was so much pressure on this Twitter campaign that the legislation kind of got sidelined. It's not the only reason, because again, people were building those coalitions and meeting with ministers and doing all of that kind of thing. But it was a very powerful example of how this information was brought to the public very quickly about what could be a significant change to how the internet was available to Canadians. So you don't ever underestimate the value of social media. These campaigns need to be, as I said before, need to be sustained. They need to be over the long term. Don't give up if you don't get what you want right away, because change happens slowly. And as the momentum builds again, you reach this tipping point, and all of a sudden, we've got to where we want it to be. And of course, as I said, prepare for the long haul. Don't give up, and take care of yourself.